Okay, fantastic. Thank you to everyone joining us in person. We have some more people who have arrived. Lovely for the last session, and for those of you joining us online. In the last session, we explored shifts in cash assistance to people on the move, both because of and in spite of digitalization. Conversations and debates around cash assistance have raised serious questions about how humanitarian aid operates, sometimes really getting at the heart of the core ethical and moral questions around humanitarianism. And some of those questions are old ones: who gets aid and why, for how long, to what ends? But in the face of climate change and on the back of long wars and rising economic inequality, is crisis-driven humanitarian aid going to be enough? Is it fit for purpose? As the sector, as the university, also faces calls to decolonize and localize, is it responsible to organize expertise, donor money in this way, and donor money in this way? 6 years after the Grand Bargain, there are possibilities for multiple futures and multiple ways forward. So in this session, we've brought together people who work in think tanks and practitioners and academics to dream big and think big and ask some hard questions. So building on the last session, we are asking them to consider how they might define or think about or imagine a post-humanitarian future. And what do you think a post-humanitarian future looks like? What's required? What kind of infrastructures, relationships, and so forth. So we have with us in this session Juliet Parker from ALNAP. She is the director of ALNAP. ALNAP focuses on strengthening humanitarian action through evaluation and learning. Juliet is responsible for working with the Secretariat to coordinate strategy and ensure the coherence, implementation, and impact of the organization's work. She has 20 years of experience in humanitarian programming and senior level strategic management in NGOs, with a particular focus on performance and monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, or MEAL. Juliet joined ALNAP from Action Against Hunger UK, where she was their director of operations. And she's worked on the design and delivery of humanitarian response and resilience programs across the world, and is passionate about the role of evidence, learning, and uptake in improving the effective delivery of humanitarian aid. William Plowright is here, an assistant professor in international security in our School of Government and International Affairs here at Durham University. And his research spans two areas. First, the dynamics of contemporary armed conflict, and second, the politics of humanitarian assistance. He's the author of the book, Armed Groups and the Pursuit of International Legitimacy, Child Soldiers and Intrastate Wars, and The War on Rescue, the Obstruction of Humanitarian Assistance in the European Migration Crisis, which is forthcoming. Additionally, he has worked in the management of humanitarian operations for major organizations for almost 10 years, including in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, the DRC, CAR, and others. Patrick Saez is a senior research fellow and policy lead in the Humanitarian Policy Group at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI. His research focuses on the performance of humanitarian systems and efforts to reform its governance and financing. As policy lead, he oversees HPG's efforts to turn research into practice. Prior to joining ODI, he served as a senior humanitarian advisor in the UK government, providing thought leadership on a range of humanitarian policy and operational issues. He co-wrote the UK's strategy on the protection of civilians in armed conflict and wrote the latest UK humanitarian reform policy. He was DFID's lead advisor on the Syrian crisis from 2011 to 2015 and was responsible for DFID's 135 million core humanitarian funding to the UN. He also led the UK's initial response to the crisis in Venezuela and neighboring countries, and was most recently seconded as a senior policy fellow to the Center for Global Development, where he co-led the 3-year research program, Rethinking Humanitarian Reform Towards Demand-Driven, an influential body of work that analyzed structures of power and incentives that hinder reforms in the humanitarian system, and proposed actionable ideas to overcome them. So I think he'll have a lot to say about the questions we're asking today. Unfortunately, Bina DaCosta is not able to be with us due to a family emergency. So our final speaker will be Catherine Taitch, who has over 20 years of strategic and operational humanitarian and refugee response leadership and academic research on private sector collaboration and private sector collaboration experience in fragile and natural disaster affected contexts in Africa, Asia, and Middle East, in Latin America and Europe. And she has recently led the startup of World Vision International's Ukraine crisis response. She currently serves as the Global Director of Humanitarian Partnerships and Cash Voucher Programs, and as conference speaker and moderator on interagency discussions, publications on financial and digital inclusion, the role of AI in finance, and conflict-sensitive market programming, and in other functions as the Cash Cap Board Chair, the co-lead of the Interagency Collaborative Cash Delivery Platform, shortened to CCD, a member of the Grand Bargain and the SPIAC-B Humanitarian Cash and Social Protection Group, the UN's Connecting Business Initiative, Complex Emergencies Toolkit Expert Group, among other engagements. In other words, Catherine is very, very busy, and we're very lucky to have her with us. She currently leads the scale-up of World Vision's Global Cash Voucher Assistance, which has reached over 6.7 million vulnerable people in 44 countries in 2021. And she's keen to leverage disruptive change approaches using digital technology opportunities for and with local SMEs and communities for socioeconomic resilience, climate change adaptation, and self-determination across the humanitarian development nexus. Okay, fantastic. So I'm so excited to have this particular group to build on the comments that we had before in our previous panel. So I will turn it over now to Juliet to get us started.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join the panel. ALNAP's mandate is actually more of a reflective, backward-looking mandate, so it's particularly nice being asked to be on a panel looking to the future, because looking back at the learning of the past, of course, the big question is always like, so what? What are the implications? So I thought maybe hopefully what was useful for me to do today was to present a few of the findings from our State of the Humanitarian System report that we published last month. If you're not aware of it, the State of the Humanitarian System report is a tome, a huge 2 or 3 years worth of analysis that ALNAP produces every few years, looking at how the sector is performing, where we're making progress and where we're not, and the implications and considerations for the future. So the last 4 years, which is the period that the report covers, have really seen a cascade of crises. So the COVID pandemic, increasing crisis as a result of climate change, and also protracted conflicts, have pushed up levels of humanitarian need very significantly, with the UN Humanitarian Needs Overview suggesting there's a 70% increase in humanitarian need over the last 4 years. At the same time, humanitarian funding has doubled over the last 10 years, but has plateaued more recently, but is not keeping pace with the increase in humanitarian need. When we look back at the reporting periods, the previous State of the Humanitarian System report from 2015 to 17 was really kind of typified by a progress in humanitarian policy, where humanitarian actors were coming together to make collaborative commitments, frameworks for action, and to really set in place the expectations and commitments that they felt were needed in order to set the sector up in order to respond to crises in the future. However, this reporting period has really seen the sector struggle to be able to live out those commitments in practice, and particularly at a time of increasing global challenges, and where the conditions for delivery of assistance have become more difficult. There's been significant global turbulence over this last few years, with geopolitical shifts intensifying crises and rendering the humanitarian community more impotent to prevent and respond effectively. One of our conclusions from the report, is that the humanitarian system is under direct threat in many countries around the globe, and that we cannot take multilateral support for international humanitarian law as a given. This has led to renewed questions about the place of humanitarian aid from within, and the international humanitarian community and antagonism towards it from the outside. So with that as a context, there were 4 kind of key points for consideration that I thought it was useful to make. One is around the scope of humanitarian action. If we are seeing increasing number of crises, and an increasing scope of humanitarian action and a much larger humanitarian sector, we will also find increasing levels of humanitarian need. The implication of this is that the funding gap between need and funding available is going to continue to grow and to widen. And that means that the sector, or some are saying, that means that the sector will need to have a rethink about its scope. The issue of mission creep in humanitarian aid has come up many, many, many times over the years, but there is a significant implication for what it's going to be possible for the humanitarian sector to realistically be able to do, and the number of priorities it's going to be able to address as it looks to the future. However, one thing I would say, one of our consistent findings from the report is that the humanitarian sector, when properly resourced, is very good at immediate humanitarian assistance. So that's one area where there was definite positive performance indicators. The second is around the humanitarian sector's ability to transform and evolve. So we know from the State of the Humanitarian System reports that the humanitarian sector is changing and evolving and getting better in the delivery of aid. However, it's not managing to evolve fast enough to keep up with the changes that are happening in the world. Also, for many years now, there have been calls for transformation of the sector, significant concerns that the sector as it is not fit to be able to address the challenges of the future. But whilst we've seen many improvements, transformation is a long way off. And actually on the key areas of accountability to affected populations, localization, and linking relief and development, the sector is showing a frustrating lack of progress. In fact, in one of our recent reports that we put out, you'll see that the recommendations coming out from evaluations in those areas are almost word for word the same as they were 20 years ago. So there's a real lack of progress in those areas, and those are the transformation areas. The other is around the model, the relevance and influence of a Western-led aid model, which itself is in question. If colonial legacies continue to be challenged and the political contours of a multipolar world become more starkly defined, the role of aid may have to change. Localization and decolonization were by far the biggest fit for purpose questions that were coming out of our surveys for the State of the Humanitarian System report. And those discussions have really big implications on the role of the sector in the future, whether it leads responses or whether it supports responses. And nobody knows whether the current attention will result in more distributed power in the system but certainly there's been a very tangible shift in the volume and articulation of demands for change coming from leaders from the global south. And my final point is that the humanitarian sector is only a very small contributor to the overall humanitarian effort. And we know each time we produce a State of the Humanitarian System report, we get a lot of very good challenges on how we set the parameters and limits on what is or isn't the humanitarian sector. And the reality is the edges of the sector are extremely porous. And our sense is that looking to the future, it's going to be much harder for the humanitarian sector to continue to operate in isolation of the massive diversity of actors who are engaged in informal or alternative forms of humanitarianism. So I hope that's useful. Just 4 points from the State of the Humanitarian System report for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And I'm afraid I'm going to maybe echo a lot of what Juliet has just said. But first of all, I wanted to object to the idea of a post-humanitarian future, because I really hope that human beings will continue to help each other. And also we know for a fact, thanks, for example, to the work of Alex Duval, that humanitarian aid has been quite instrumental in drastically reducing mortality, disease, and hunger over the past 75 years. But there are indeed now worrying signs that those effects are starting to ebb away. And the catastrophic famine that is actually unfolding now in the Horn of Africa is, for me, an example of that. And I think that's because of two main challenges. The first one is one of efficacy. International humanitarian aid is too small to absorb the human impacts of crises. As Juliet was saying, it has plateaued around $25 billion over the past 4 years, and we might have reached the limits of its growth. But it's also not the right instrument to tackle the root causes of risk and vulnerability. It's a system that's built around voluntary giving by states or individuals, reactiveness to sudden disasters, and short-termism. It's often too late in responding to what are mostly predictable crises, and often too rigid to adapt to long-term crises. And second, I think there's a challenge of legitimacy, and that has come to the fore recently with the calls for decolonization, etc. The normative framework for humanitarian aid, IHL, humanitarian principles, is increasingly ignored. Governments, civil society organizations, the private sector, and affected people themselves are becoming more assertive in challenging a sector that is either avoiding them or excluding them. And that's definitely not accountable to them. So my wish is that we would move from a humanitarian response model to a broader crisis management model. And I think that 3 fundamental shifts are still to be made in my view. I think we need much more political and financial investment towards prevention. That's focusing on conflict and climate change. The ongoing trend of increased targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure has to be reversed. But of course, it's easier said than done in the current geopolitical climate, of course. And it looks like there is no consensus around basic humanitarian norms. But that's precisely why it is so important. I think we also need to stop thinking that civilian protection is something that is always facilitated by international organizations, and at ODI, we are starting a project that will look at communities' agency in protecting themselves. B, we definitely need to rebalance the set of instruments in each type of crises. We can't be using the same toolbox everywhere, particularly if the main tool is humanitarian aid, because there's just not enough of it. There has to be a step change. There has actually been a step change over the past 5 years in development finance going to support government systems and markets in crisis-affected countries, particularly from the World Bank. And this, for example, supports government safety nets that can provide financial assistance to vulnerable households in times of crises, as we've seen on a large scale with COVID response. And that should be accelerated and expanded to other multilateral development banks, but also bilateral donors. I think there's even more room for change when it comes to climate finance. At the moment, most climate finance is spent on mitigation, not adaptation. I think adaptation is around 28%. And crisis-affected countries only receive around 12% of that 28%. This needs to improve fast if we want to see sustainable improvements in resilience to climate-related hazards in particular. And C, I think we need to stop tinkering around the edges of humanitarian reform. We've heard calls for transformation. We thought that COVID and now the war in Ukraine would be watershed moments, but what we've actually seen is a pivot back to habitual practices. At HPG, we've recently hosted roundtables on Ukraine and on the Horn of Africa in recent months. And my overall takeaway is that we are actually in a situation where the Ukraine response is probably over-resourced and still not reaching frontline responders, while the massive humanitarian response that's needed in the Horn is not happening because of a lack of resources. And there are interesting pilots to improve anticipatory action, long-term planning, multi-year financing, localization, accountability. But as long as the financing and governance models and the architecture don't change, there won't be any meaningful transformation, I think. So with colleagues at the Center for Global Development, we suggested last year some ideas that include, for example, shifting planning and coordination to an area-based model where coordination can be placed in the hands of local actors and be truly multi-sectoral. Another idea was to create independent funding pools, or independently managed at least, at the global and country level, where donors would pre-arrange and pool their humanitarian funds towards predictable crises on a multi-year, multi-sectoral basis. And we have models of how to do this with funds like Gavi or the Global Fund. And at the country level, we recommend a shift towards multi-sectoral funds that should become the main intermediaries, particularly when it comes to passing through resources to frontline actors. And again, we have pooled funds in the UN system, and we have NGO pooled funds that could serve as a model, but that would need to evolve to deliver this ambition. And finally, we also recommended independent feedback and audit mechanisms through which community feedback would be collected independently rather than through operational agencies, and where agencies would be audited independently again on their participation and accountability practices. Again, there are existing models such as HQAI, but the large agencies in the system do not use those systems at the moment. We might have spotted a common thread here, which is independence. And that's because too many functions at the moment are concentrated in the same donor and operational organizations. And that is one of the main sources of power imbalance in the sector. So separating those functions will be critical. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hello from Greece. Thanks so much for inviting me. With Catherine, Juliet, and Patrick's extensive experience, I almost worry I'm on the wrong panel, but I'm very happy to be here and try to summarize thinking on humanitarian futures in a few moments. By coincidence, I and a few other colleagues have been working on an edited volume that's addressing very much these types of questions. Kind of, where are we? What is the state of crisis, and in what direction is the humanitarian system going? And for all the conversations, that fascinating conversations we've had on the topic, I still find it hard to organize my thinking. And I think part of how I try to frame it for myself, at least, is to ask the questions, how ought the humanitarian system look compared to how do I actually expect it to look? Also, don't want to repeat too much of what Juliet had said, but because some of my thoughts are very much around sort of growth and scope. But how ought it to look? It ought to be more decentralized, more localized, more diversified, decolonized. It ought to be better able to address crises like ongoing climate crisis, migration. For as long as I've been in the humanitarian sector, these conversations have been around, albeit with different language. Questions about racism within the sector are not new, right? They're not. They're framed differently now, and a different language is used. But these discussions have been there for at least as long as I've been around, and I know longer as well. My perspective is therefore, not to be overly pessimistic and cynical, is a little different with regard to change. I don't. In terms of the question, what is the post-humanitarian future? I don't think there is one. I don't think there's a post-humanitarian system within my lifetime. Part of the reason for that are the things that Juliet already kind of summarized and described for us. The incredible growth in the sector over recent years. Not just growth that addresses increasing needs, right? As the LNAP report, of course, notes, in recent years, we've seen higher numbers of people in humanitarian need than before. Earlier this year, UNHCR said the number of displaced had gone over 100 million people for the first time since they've been keeping those types of records. But also an expansion of what we define as humanitarian needs, and what we as humanitarians define as the humanitarian terrain in which we ought to intervene. That increase in scope. Earlier today, I was viewing a panel from the Humanitarian Congress in Berlin. It was an incredible panel with a number of LGBTQI+ colleagues from across the sector, discussing issues around needs and challenges for the LGBTQI plus community, and how the humanitarian sector needs to expand in order to be able to address those needs and those rights. These are very positive initiatives, but they're also massive growth in what we're defining ourselves as the scope of humanitarian assistance and where it ought to intervene. I think the growth in MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support across the sector, is another example of this. Even at the early stages of my career 10 years ago, MHPSS was not discussed in as serious a way as it is now. Sort of put shortly, within the humanitarian system, the call is, there may not be consensus, but the general call is for the system to do more, to go more places, to engage with more people on more subjects, addressing more needs, and embracing larger diversity than ever before, but without that meaningful change in the system that actually allows for it, and as Patrick already observed, without the means necessary to do so. At the same time, though, as Juliet summarized, we've seen that massive growth in the sector. I'm a political scientist by background. What happens to any political actor when it starts to grow in any given political space? It encounters resistance. And that was the subject of my more recent experience, including a book I wrote called The War on Rescue, which looks at NGOs operating in Europe during the peak of migration in 2015 and the ensuing humanitarian crisis that leads right up to the present. I was lucky enough to do a few hundred interviews with lots of different NGOs. My background's in MSF, but I reached out to others as well. And the thing that I drew most from those discussions were how shocked people in the humanitarian sector were at the opposition they encountered from European states while they tried to deliver humanitarian assistance in Europe. There was this general view that because of how westernized the system is, that Europe is the safe place, Europe is the home, Europe is where we go back to, where we as the the Western international humanitarians go back to. It's where we have our logistical bases, it's where we gather our funding. And of course, the experience of organizations during the crisis was completely different. We're all familiar with how search and rescue organizations on the Mediterranean were essentially forced to play a horrible game of musical chairs, searching for ports around the Mediterranean while having boats filled with people who'd literally been pulled out of the water in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. That was in the headlines, and we're all familiar with it. What I found interesting from my research and the conversations I was lucky enough to have was how much else was going on, right? What happened to those humanitarian staff when they arrived at port? The harassment they got from everyone from customs officials to police, government agents, also civilians. In Croatia, high amount of police violence towards refugees and migrants and humanitarian actors. In Greece, where I am now, lucky enough to be here doing research, prominent and public arrests of humanitarians and activists. Some organizations are still being dragged through the courts in Italy for things dating back to providing attempts to provide humanitarian assistance in 2015. As you remember it, or may remember from the news at the time, organizations like MSF were accused of a wide array of bizarre and almost preposterous crimes related to trafficking of criminals, related to facilitation of terrorism, disposal of waste in public places, and even public accusations that they were spreading HIV and TB by providing humanitarian assistance to people who've been pulled out of the Mediterranean. This opposition towards humanitarian assistance and the active obstruction of it by European governments, as I mentioned, came as a shock to the humanitarian sector. And this is a trend that I can only see increasing in looking towards the future. And not to be too cynical, hopefully, but we're all accustomed to the idea that states in, let's say, the military authoritarian regime of Sudan will obstruct and manipulate assistance. But I think people became more shocked when it happened in democracies. And there's preliminary evidence from research that other states have started to use those European policies as justification for their own increased obstruction of humanitarian assistance. So in addition to that spread of obstruction to Europe, States across the world are increasingly interested in governing humanitarian assistance, increasingly capable from the perspective of state capacity to be able to govern and restrict humanitarian assistance, and to seek to use it towards their own end. Notice my timer has passed 7 minutes. I apologize, I spoke too long. So to draw that to a close, not to paint too pessimistic a vision of the future, but as we see crisis and needs increase and funding go down, I think we all need to be prepared for a situation where the humanitarian system is increasingly restricted from states, including those states that have traditionally been seen as the allies of humanitarian assistance.
I hope you can hear me. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I have the pleasure now to be the last of those many fabulous speakers and trying to actually draw back to where we started. And we're talking about post-humanitarianism. I don't think there will be ever a post. I do think humanitarianism will be differently defined in the near future, just because of all the pressures, all the volatility we see in the overall global economic and climate change impact and so forth crisis context we're actually sliding into, and we're already in many contexts dramatically. So I do want to take us back, and maybe we can share the first slide if that's possible, Lauren, please, on an individual. And that individual, I call her Noru. And Noru actually has experienced some very horrifying situations. She and her mother had to flee actually her home when the conflict grew closer, bombardment happened, and actually her dad, who was an opposition leader, was actually kidnapped by the regime, the political leadership of that country they lived in, and they had to flee. So they experienced for 3 months a quite desperate journey, as many people experience it, escaping conflict, destruction, the extortion, abuse, physical and mental abuse, drought, and obviously not feeling well on that journey, crossing over country borders and crossing over the sea, finally thinking that they would reach a safe haven in a host country, and finally also reuniting with some more extended relatives that had already gone along that journey before them. In all these moments of desperation, they were given assistance. They were given assistance by people that were very warm-hearted. They were given assistance by humanitarian organizations. They had to register, they had to fill out forms, they had to give their names, they had to give their iris scan, their biometric fingerprint digitally. They received sometimes some assistance also in the form of cash or in kind. But very often also they were actually exploited. People pretended to be working for organizations to help them, and they were not. People were asking for bribes to help them to go on their journey. And they were obviously also physically abused. In all that experience, we do think that maybe there could have been another journey experience for Noru to finally make it to safety with her mom. And so I want to take you on another option of a journey. If we can go to the next slide, please, where maybe some other tools and enablers could have helped more, possibly, or possibly not. So when we're looking at humanitarianism, I would really like to emphasize that agency and self-determination of the individual that's affected by crisis or conflict, climate change-induced disaster, that this individual has the right to have self-agency, the right to determine what happens to him or her. And so the issue here is really, if Noru and her mom would have had the opportunity to actually indicate what kind of assistance they needed along the journey, indicate what kind of information they needed, indicate what kind of support, information, and protection they required at different points. And they were provided with the relevant, not only information, but practical assistance in real time through possibly mobile information, digital information, and also very tangible assistance on the site. Well, they could have probably had a different experience. If they would have been able to receive remittances from their overseas relatives on that journey, they would have probably been more able and empowered to make certain choices that would have less exposed them to more vulnerability and risk. They would have been able to access digital savings from their home community and overseas community. They would have possibly been able to access market and route or journey information. They would have been able to access information about legal advice, protection, and medical and health support on their journey. And they would have possibly also been informed about impending natural disasters, like a storm, a tropical storm building up before they actually tried to cross that sea in that little boat that finally made it to the other side. So with all that in mind, we do think that cash, whether digital or in form of banknotes, in whatever form, even cryptocurrency, and the ability to have digital tools and to access and to manage information is critical in nowadays world, as we see in many contexts, even in very fragile contexts. World Vision actually has delivered a lot of cash, actually nearly 70% of it as electronic version in fragile contexts around the world. But on top of that, we also know that my colleagues have spoken about social protection mechanisms, national governments, digital social registries that, as we saw in Ukraine, are playing more and more a critical role, especially where infrastructure and literacy levels are very high, and where this infrastructure should be used and government systems should be strengthened instead of setting up parallel humanitarian actor systems. Now, with that, we also know that blockchain plays increasingly a very critical role in the humanitarian world, and not only there, but in the private sector as well. And we will not get around engaging more and more with that technology. So what does that mean then for individuals? Can they actually have basically that one particular data set that's a portable wallet or information system that really enables them to dock on everywhere, and they can decide what to share, what information to share with whom, and they can actually access health support online or through other means, try to connect to government medical systems, try to connect to humanitarian actors that can enable them, and also engage digitally on an online and offline and real life marketplace as traders, as information sharers, as agents of choice, as empowered or self-determining individuals, and not as recipients of aid. So if we're looking at this beautiful new world, you also know that all this technology has downsides, right? So we know that there is a lot of artificial intelligence enabled software programming. There is data harvesting happening all over the place, the internet, WhatsApp, Facebook, and so forth. So with that information, bringing together all this existing data, using surveillance systems, social media, environmental conditions, weather information, political unrest information, migration patterns, movement data from mobile phone network data analysis, and so forth, you can actually do quite some detailed analysis and real life analysis on behavior, on movement patterns, on spending patterns. Insurance companies or loan outlets, microfinance institutions may want to use that to see, is that potential client able to repay that loan? Is it a refugee? What's the status? With all that information available, there's a lot of transparency, possibly. There's a lot of power as well. The question is, for whom is that power? And who has the ability to utilize this power? Who can determine who accesses which information and which resources and who distributes them? If we go to the next slide, please, we can see that there are opportunities to not just look at the cost efficiency ratio for already scarce humanitarian assistance that needs to prioritize investment. And we know in the cash space, especially, we hear more and more, and in the humanitarian space, what's the value for money here? We don't hear that only from donors. We also ask that question ourselves because we know there will be less resources for more protracted crisis, for more humanitarian need. So how can we build financial resilience with the individuals that are already exposed and vulnerable in the future? How can we ensure that there is not only a limited acknowledgement of the human factor and to look at risk minimization when we're looking at anti-terrorism law and at due diligence processes that all of us have to go through before we can even design and provide assistance to the most needy? The individuals in this context are the people that are affected by disaster. And so not only my agency, World Vision, but many other agencies have built up their own data, beneficiary registration, tracking, impact tracking and monitoring systems. We, for example, have the last mile mobile solution, LMMS, but there are many more of those. And if we are able to harmonize those systems, that they speak to each other, interoperability being the key word of the day and probably for the future, without sharing personally identifiable information of the individual, really ensuring data protection is taken serious. And if those individuals can decide themselves with whom they want to share what information, where they want to access what financial assistance, where they do want to invest and grow their own financial means, even if they're on the move, where they can dock on with maybe a humanitarian choice passport that's blockchain enabled and safe in order to access legal, health protection, shelter, transport information and other services. And most importantly, where they can be able to access and significantly engage on their own choice with local and international online and offline on-site markets for job opportunities, for income generation, and also access risk and early warning information. Then I think we can really talk about a humanitarian future that's not post, but that's focusing on the individual, that is having agency. Now, we do have these different futures for Nauru, but what do we think is the best and how do we engage? Because we can speak a lot about we need to change the humanitarian system, and I fully agree, it is not where it should be. We all have our responsibility. But what do we do to empower, to support the individual? Because the opportunities and the technologies are out there. How do we make sure that there is informed and safe choice for the individual, and that it's not maybe a neo-colonistic approach of private sector organizations that want to utilize data, or oppressive governments and regimes that want to utilize data and want to utilize financial assistance to possibly protect themselves or exploit those people that are vulnerable. So I ask ourselves again, what choice would we make if we were Nauru? What choice, what avenue can we take? And how can we ensure that we build resilience, economic resilience, and agency of the individual beyond the system? Thank you so much.